Welcome to Fliplanthropy number 4, our tongue twister series that is really meant to flip the script on philanthropic structures and traditions and norms, and be both a challenge, a provocation of how we can do things differently. And when we say differently, we mean quite radically differently. Today's session is titled Money and Movement because it's really exploring dynamic, currently evolving structures, new ways of redistributing resources and adding a justice lens to giving, as well as focusing on the model itself. What's the vehicle of redistribution? There's some examples, but the vehicle is also upheld by values, practices, cosmologies, lots of different ingredients. And we will have a couple of perspectives on how these models can be a radical departure from the slightly antiquated systems of traditional and dominant philanthropic structures, ones that really activate and work with politicized grassroots communities and frontline communities, and hold participatory, decentralized structures as an inherently valuable system for creating trust and crowd wisdom. So first off, I'm going to call on Lisl Schöpflin, who we are also now in Partners in Crime with Guerilla, for a perspective from the other side of the ocean, more so. Take us away, Lisl.
Okay, first of all, I just want to say thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel from the awesome team that I'm getting to know at the Guerilla Foundation. I do want to just, I'm not in the US, but I am from the US. I'm from California, and have done a lot of funding around progressive movement building there. And so I do want to just acknowledge and have us all just take a moment essentially to acknowledge the grief, the shock, the fear, the anxiety, all the different confusion. I know I'm sort of in a moment of not many thoughts happening. I just want to acknowledge that is a real, and that, there's implications that could echo through the world. So I'm Lisl Schöpflin. I was a little bit of a background on me. I'm from California, but my parents are from Austria and Germany. So that's also how I got connected with the work happening with the Guerilla Foundation, and then Europe is also connecting to some of the sort of philanthropy work in Germany as well. I also am, besides the work I do with philanthropy, I also am a historian of colonial Andean history, and particularly indigenous history, ethnohistory, really around the dynamics of sort of what is oral and literacy? What does it mean when the Spanish came? And, what are those legacies of colonialism that we continue to feel, as the elections just made bare? And so that I bring that up just because I also bring that really into how I think about the philanthropy and the way that I'm approaching it and the way I'm thinking about change, in something that is really like about an iterative, you stay in it. This is centuries, this is generations of work around these various forms of, starting with colonialism to capitalism and patriarchy and all these things that you all, I'm assuming, are really aware of. So my other hat is with this, is philanthropies. I'm the president and chair of the Panorama Foundation, which is a family foundation based in California, founded by my father in 2001. I then became the president in 2017, and now have a co-chair, Holly Robertson. We just did a refresh where we were very much focused in the US. We had a whole program around really progressive movement building and election get out the vote efforts. So, and we continue to do that. I did personal giving also in this last round, but we now are shifting to really focusing on building power and self-determination in the global majority, with this focus in the Americas and the Caribbean, and honor around regeneration, culture, and bringing those in, like bringing together elements of climate justice, food sovereignty, human rights, along with sustainability, wellness, and also sort of language and the creative practices. Throughout with Panarea, there's always been a, we always are putting, I'll get into it later, but we've always been putting and forefronting communities, the movements first in terms of how we follow and think about doing our philanthropy. But I'll get into that. I'm also, just so you know, I also am on the board of the Schöpflin Foundation that my father and his siblings started in Germany, where also democracy is a really big element, a really big part of all the work there. And then also I work with my dad on the Spore initiative, which is also based out of Berlin, where they're doing, it's a cultural platform and hub to really raise voices of marginalized and silenced voices that are in the global majority, and then also in the community, in the neighborhood of Neukölln. Especially, they've become very activated around everything that's happening with Palestine and Israel, and in Germany, and the very intense environment there. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about participatory grant making, and I just want to say I'm really excited to hear about all of your, I'm really excited about the dialogue, because I feel like there's just an infinite amount, and really thinking about like, what does participatory to me? I think of it in this really holistic way all the way through. It's not only the grant making, but it's how everybody's engaging, from the donors, the people with the money, to the people who are the professionals who are like helping implement the things, to the decision making and the way we can share power. So, and I also want to say I'm in a context where it's about, it's a perpetuity model, not by my choice, but that's where we are. But we need to work with creating, and I'm probably speaking to the choir, doing philanthropy that's about when we get to a point when philanthropy is no longer necessary. But in the meantime, how do we do it is really important. And I really believe that that how will get us to that point where then philanthropy no longer is necessary. And so I think that's where I'm really been focusing on and trying to figure out, within these contracts of like traditional family foundations, pushing the envelope of what is a traditional family foundation and how do we make it more participatory, the how, and how can we bring in more people, more voices, more equity, more diversity, more inclusion into it to actually then change the whole system from the inside. Needing also all the other impulses to really radicalize how we even think about wealth accumulation. So that is a little preface of sort of where I've positioned myself. So when I think about philanthropy, and I will say I come from really the family, like I feel like my organizing, a big part of it has been this very like family, like I'm a person of wealth, I'm working family. Part of the participatory has been working with my family. And it has been about like meeting my family where they're at, engaging, not, for me personally, not going into an us them, going into dialogue, and going and trying to like work through knowing what the principles are, values are, and trying to work within the family within that. And it has actually been like some places like, that's definitely not working. Like, I am not going to engage with that family member because that is just toxic. And other places, it's been really, really rewarding. And there's been a lot of movement that we've been able to do. So I just want to acknowledge that if you're coming from that kind of institute, even if it's a non-family institutional, like the interpersonal part, that interpersonal is participatory. Like allowing everyone to show up and allowing yourself to show up is participatory. And that can move mountains. I really believe that. So then in a more tactical, in Panarea, we also really, on the governance level, we also focus just on who's in the room, who bringing diversity into the actual board level. And again, it hasn't been like it hasn't been something that's like from 0 to 100. It was this iterative thing. At first, non-family members who are trusted, non-family members who are experts in the field in the US, non-family members who are now we're working on this, experts in the global majority in the Americas and the Caribbean. Within philanthropy too, who have that bridge building, and then to really bringing in the well, it's not an either or, but also then acknowledging also all the community, the representatives, the experts in the field into this position of the seat of this power of the governance on the board level. And that has, like, it's I don't know in Europe, but in the US, it was very surprising that we would have experts with their vast backgrounds and experiences, and they're like, oh no, we're always on the advisory council. You know, we've never been brought into actually sitting on the board. And it's just like, it's crazy. And so it seems really simple and straight, and so it's simple to do, but it also takes a lot of work, and a lot of foundations just want to keep their boards really small with their, you know, in the norm of the sort of white upper class model. So I feel like I'm not going to talk. I know that the Guerrilla Foundation has a super radical, and I'm really excited to get to learn from it. So I'm not going to speak too much around that, and I'll go to the grant making, but also just acknowledging the not bringing in non-family, bringing in staff, creating collaborative models, really functioning. Like, we're trying in Panorama to see, like, what does it really mean to have a multi-protagonist model that everybody's voice is included. It's an inclusion that includes everybody, including the person of wealth. And this is why I feel like there's been some discourse that can be really, I found kind of doing us a disservice by not including everybody within the realms of understanding power dynamics, and within the realm of understanding all the systemic inequality and racism that is going into all of this. And yet still everyone is included for what they can bring from their position. So easier said than done, I have to say. It's really not easy. And so then also, going to the grant making, like I said, in Panorama, we're learning. We're in a deep learning mode right now about what it means to work in the global majority, the global South. We had done, you know, participatory grant making, there's the straightforward models, you could say, around the flow fund, where you really, like, I'm part of a cohort of donors that is supporting an Indigenous women's flow fund, where the donors have said, I'm giving you this money, and then the women have complete say. There's a total firewall. I've never met them. They get to just decide. And it's totally, and they've come up with their own ways of doing philanthropy that are based on their traditions, their ceremonies, their ways of understanding how they want to come to their decisions. And I feel like that has been it's a super gratifying, you know, to be able to just do that when the context is there. We also, in Panorama itself, brought in, we experimented when we were still in the US with participatory model, also flow fund, around arts and climate change, where through our networks, we identified some flow funders, about I think it was 4 individuals, along with 1 staff from Panorama. We decided to create actually more of a porous, where the board, I didn't know. We just said, okay, this is the budget, this is the theme, everything else, the flow funders get to decide. So we did that. And that was more like, that was really experimentation. That was really good. We decided to not continue it, since we're shifting our strategy and trying to understand the context of the global majority, working in the Americas and the Caribbean, and really understanding context-based. When we're really working with Indigenous communities, we're really working with Afro-descendant communities, understanding what that means, and the models of participatory grant making in the US might not translate into the context that we're working in. One thing I forgot to say, I feel like in the framing of participatory grant making, why I really also am excited about it is, one, it's about this, obviously, like the sharing of power or shifting of power of who's making the decisions. It's putting forward the experts that are in the field, the communities who are making the decisions then, and that's just like, that just makes sense. But I'm always say, like, it needs to have a really transformative element to it, because it's not about just like kicking the ball down the road and saying, oh no, I'm not responsible. I'm gonna, like, now I don't have to I feel so good, I'm a rich person, I'm not making that decision. But that doesn't mean that the dynamics and all the stuff that comes with money doesn't continue. Everyone has a money story. Everyone is dealing with the power dynamics in relation to money. And so I feel like in doing it, it needs to really be like relationship centered, people centered, transformative, acknowledging the healing and the trauma that's in that, and empowering in a fundamental level, and not just oh, now I don't have to make that decision, I've done my job. So just wanted to say that in the meta. So now what does it mean, what we're doing in right now also, we use also, there's a lot of intermediaries who are using participatory grant making models, like Agroecology Fund, like the Global Green Grants. Those are US based, who are then moving money out of non-US, that allow basically for us, we're learning. They are able to do a lot of infrastructure. They have the advisors on the ground. It's another way of saying, okay, I don't need to make the decisions. We can really use other experts and other models to move the money. There's also actually working with intermediaries that are in nation. So like we have the FASOL, which is an intermediary group that use a participatory model in Mexico. There's the Fondo, the Peruvian Social Environmental Fund, the Social Environmental Fund of the Global South Alliance. There's one in Brazil that really uses participatory models to move the money, where again, us as a foundation from the Global North, we don't know yet. We're in this like deep learning to say, here, we're going to keep moving the funds through these other models. And then I also I think there's those really, really putting the decisions in the hands of the communities. And then there is within, I believe, in the trend, like traditional grant making, where there's a program officer, someone who's saying, I'm going to give the money. How you do that is also, I think, can really be about participatory. It can also be like, if you're listening and you're saying, I give you an invitation that you can say whatever kind of funding you need, that it doesn't have to be project oriented. Like we just heard a story of in Peru, an environmental activist in the community had been killed. And so then they came to us and said, actually, we would like to use this for a lawyer, or we'd like to use this for a creative, doing a creative practice around for their memories. And being like, okay, that's totally fine. Like whatever it is that you need is what we're there for, rather than coming in and saying it has to be for this project. I believe that type of relationship-centered, deep listening is also an element of participatory. It's being in relationship and in solidarity, in accompaniment with these communities for the long run. It's about, recognizing the community comes first, then everyone is intersectional. People, organizations, communities, movements are intersectional, and it's not a one issue specific, and being able to hold that and allow them, then however the money needs to move, it's allowing for that. Yeah, and just, the obvious kind of when it really means to be in solidarity, it's infrastructure, it's the non-sexy, it's the multi-year grant making, it's the general operating, it's allowing the movements to decide, the people, the organizations to decide how they want the money to go. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I will say one last thing, again, around really believing that participatory really comes down to dialogue and relationship. And I'm going to be super corny right now because I'm from California, so I get to do that. It's about us being who we want, what we want to see. It's about front centering love, and empathy, and meeting people there, and working from that. And I think that goes from the family to the really annoying wealth managers, or not being in dialogue there, to obviously, of course, how we engage with communities. So I'll stop there.
Amazing. Thank you, Lisl. I mean, you're opening a lot of fronts for us, and naming a lot of assumptions that we carry into this work, and intentions that we carry. And those really color what we're hoping to achieve, even walking into a decision-making room. That have up until now at least been massively insular, opaque spaces. So clearly an obstacle to the interpersonal and an obstacle to participation. So this is something that we're trying to erode as fast as possible, and to deepen the concrete practice that we practice in-house. Our ship captain, Romy, is going to give us a bit of a tour of what we do and which assumptions and intentions we carry around.
Thank you so much. And yeah, also thanks to the comms team for organizing all of these sessions. And I'm very happy to be here and see you all. Thanks for coming out on this day. I think that was a choice. Very happy to see so many faces. And yeah, like I want to share a little bit of the history and then like really move to where we are right now with our effort to become more participatory, which I think is really an ongoing effort and has been a very like long time coming conversation and then action in the Gorilla Foundation. I was so fortunate to meet Tony, our founding funder, who I think is also in the call. I saw you earlier somewhere. Say hi. In 2016. And the great thing about this was that Tony was quite open to setting something up that he didn't have a kind of fully complete picture of himself, and really kind of had this idea of like supporting activism and doing something on systems change and something with like a kind of broad perspective. And it was great to kind of like start early on to like build that vision together in a way. And then Ivan joined shortly after, and now we're kind of like a great small team of 5 and soon 6 people who really like pour, I think, all of our hearts, personalities, like also like individual interests and efforts into this organization. And I think that is already one thing that makes us a little different from many other foundations, that we all have a connection to activism, that we all have our own issues that we're passionate about and affected by and interested in, that we really bring into this work. And then we just like went about to start setting something up. And the basic founding idea was that we want to support systems change, which also for us in the beginning already meant that we cannot really fund in silos. Like that, like there is this idea of intersectionality around. A lot of people are talking about it, but most foundations do have programs. Most foundations do really have limits as to what can be funded by us, or talk to this person if you want to be funded for this issue, if talk to this other person if you want to be funded for that issue, right? And that had also been my own experience with fundraising previously. And I really had a very strong aversion to building something that would reproduce these boxes. And we also had this basic idea that kind of generally grassroots movements are very under-resourced and underfunded. So that's where we wanted to focus our efforts at the beginning. So that was like a couple of the founding thoughts, basically, from which we departed when we set up the Gorilla Foundation. And which of course also meant that if you have a limited pot of money, you need to somehow narrow down who you then actually fund, because systems change and intersectionality is great, but that also means a potential massive body of groups and organizations that you could be funding. So the first choice was to kind of like focus on Europe, which in many ways is the source of much devastation, exploitation, and havoc that is happening all around the world. It is also where we were based as like the founding team, and where we felt we had the best connections and experience. And so beyond this geographic narrowing down, we really focused on small groups, grassroots organizing, directly affected people that are self-organizing, because that is really the like sliver of philanthropic funding that is usually the smallest in any kind of study that you see about where does funding go. It's usually bigger, well-resourced NGOs that operate internationally that like siphon off like most of the funding that is flowing. And so with these kind of cornerstones, we were able to kind of narrow down who we want to target. So we have a pretty strict limit of 150,000 euros annual budget size, which really limits the amount of organizations out there that we can actually fund. And also means that we fund mainly kind of small unregistered groups. Very often we're like the first or among the first couple of funders that give money to this group. And in that space, with this intersectional lens and with the systems change focus in Europe, we're literally one of the few funders that fund there, especially when you look all over Europe, right? Like there's a couple of foundations, like for example, in Germany, we have a movement foundation that only funds in the German-speaking countries with kind of a similar idea and model and ethos and political value system, but they don't fund in Serbia, Slovenia, Poland, Hungary, Italy, etc., right? And that is something that we learned over the course of the years since 2016 when we started, where most of our funding was flowing where we had our networks, which was in the UK and Germany and a little bit around, then expanding to Poland, etc. And kind of like with growing experience, like really we realized that like the biggest value added we have, also with the amounts of grant sizes that we give out, we do have in the south and the east of Europe, and maybe not in Germany, where there's also a big need. And I'm not even saying like we're still also funding in Germany, because like there's also differences between the west and the east of Germany, you know, Berlin versus the countryside, etc. So it's not that we're completely moving out of these places, but we also focus much more now on channeling money into the south and the east of Europe. So that's a little bit on the kind of founding idea and like where we fund what we fund. And another thing was that we really wanted to be approachable to the movements that we want to be resourcing, and that we actually not just like want to have good relationships with them, but really build an organization that kind of is part of the movement. And that sounds a little corny, but like I think there is really a big difference whether as a funder you see yourself as something that is outside, that is providing money to a system, to people, to groups, to organizations, whatever you want to call it, then seeing yourself as an active participant that is really in solidarity with the people that you support. And Lisl, you also like alluded to that and coming from a different direction, but that idea of solidarity I think is really important. It's one of our core values as an organization that we have on our website, and I really want to emphasize that because there, for me there is a big felt difference, and that is in the relationships that you build, in how you talk to people, how you are sometimes also flexible with your funding and don't just stick to a certain definition or selection criteria or budget size or whatever, that you're really focusing on this relationship building aspect. And I think a lot of other organizations really fall short there because they have strict rules, which also has its like sense, you know, and it has a history where it's coming from. But that miss that point in a way of like trying that relationship based approach. And of course I also want to acknowledge that when you sit on a pot of money and you are in a salaried position, as we are in the Gorilla Foundation, and then you say, oh, we're part of the movement, you know, that there is a certain like, there's a couple of things to consider there. So first of all, like, you know, that like when shit hits the fan, people are getting attacked, people are getting killed, you know, activists, like that is not going to be you, right? So there is always this difference. There's always this power difference. There's always this like advantageous position that you're in as a foundation, where you can always say, we stop funding you and nothing is going to happen to you. Like you don't, there is no real accountability mechanism, right? There, you can move away. There's always going to be another group that wants your money. On the other hand, you as a group, this might be your only funder, right? So being very clear about that while still trying to build these relationships and being humble and trying to navigate this space, like naming these power differences, being aware of them, but not like hiding behind some process, hiding behind some structure, but really trying to navigate that and building these relationships based on this. I think that's a little bit the ethos that we try to live. Not saying that this always works well. I'm 100% sure there's grantees that had a shitty experience that feel we're not like, or we're exactly like other foundations. And, you know, like that always happens. So it's like, that is the intention behind what we do. And I think it comes through in many cases. Given that narrative internally and this aspiration, like over the course of the years, and I mean, Tony, maybe you want to talk about this later. I don't know how many times in strategy meetings and conversations that we had, I mentioned the idea of having some sort of activist panel or activist council or whatever we called them, to start making decisions about our grant budget. And that literally came up again and again, and we discussed it again and again. We started with an external prototype, so to say, we started funding Fund Action, which is a participatory activist-led fund. So I was part of the group that set up this organization, and the Guerrilla Foundation also provided some core funding in the beginning, in the first couple of years for that. So we had an external experience of setting up a participatory organization where activists were in the lead. And then I brought that experience back into the Guerrilla Foundation for us to then say at some point, which was the end of 2021, okay, let's do a 2-year trial where we also move to participatory grant making. And that was 2022, 2023. And now we've got this confirmed basically, and we're still running this participatory grant making program where 2/3 of our budget are decided about by an activist council. You find the people on the website if you're interested. They also scout grants for us. They participate in the screening of potential grant candidates, and they take the final decisions about the grants. And we also have them feed into more and more. So we're also in a process of like improving this program into the decisions about this other third of the grant budget, which goes into smaller, faster, more flexible grants where a participatory process is not necessarily the best because they're supposed to go out really quickly. And that's also one of the tensions with like participation, like it costs a lot of time and energy. Where does that actually make sense? How much money do you invest in the participatory process to get how much money out of the door? Like, I think all of these things are usually kind of like brushed over a little bit too quickly when you talk about participation as the end goal and the greatest goal for everything. And they also get an individual flow fund. So each activist council member gets a €2,500 flow fund per year that they can just distribute to whatever organization they find in their region, in their locality, where they're like, here, they're small, they can really do something with that money, and we don't need to take them through the Guerrilla Foundation process, and they just disperse that money directly. And then what we did in the beginning is we invited this first activist council in 2022 on a ticket of saying, like, you're participating in this participatory grant making program, which is distributing 2/3 of our budget. Here's the decision-making process and the structure that we have already developed for our grant making. Here's the tools that we're using, and this is how we think you should start, but always with an eye already to involving them in redesigning these processes. But like we felt it would be better to give them something in the beginning to depart from, to get into this, to also grow into this role of suddenly having to decide about money, because also, as Lisl said, like that is also a big step. And also there is a question and attention about in how far do you turn people into philanthropists or like foundation employees, right? When you put them into these positions. We can also talk about that later. And then we slowly moved into a not just participatory grant making program, but actually involving the activist council into our governance and into strategic decisions about how big is this budget actually going to be that we're distributing in this participatory way? What are the selection criteria that are going to be used? What are the processes like? How can we change them and improve them, etc.? So, and this is where we are kind of now, where we have a participatory grant making model that's running, but we also are working on introducing a participatory governance model, where we now moved as an organization to a sociocratic model, where also the team kind of starts working together in more non-hierarchical ways. All of that is a journey. I'm still being called the ship captain. We also have to change something about that. And where we have kind of a system, and I can show a slide. I'm actually not going to do it now. If people are interested, I can do it later. Where we have a way of like having different working circles in the organization and a very clear definition of who can participate in which of these working circles. There's a redistribution circle that decides about where the money goes. Funders of the Guerrilla Foundation are not involved in this redistribution circle, but the activist council is. There's a mission circle, however, where we have funders and activist council members together with the team involved. There is a transform philanthropy circle where we have all the work that is happening around organizing people with wealth, bringing more funders into the Guerrilla Foundation, because also by now we have not only Tony, but like Lisl and 9 other people that are funding the Guerrilla Foundation. So we have this whole complex of work where we actually put our funder circle to work, to also self-organize, to challenge each other, to give more money into this and other similar efforts, other intermediaries that have participatory models, etc., and also bring in other people go to conferences, talk about participation, talk about funding grassroots movements, talk about funding systems change, where we really use the experience that they have in our organization to kind of help them to go out and do this advocacy work for which they are uniquely positioned. And coming back to your point, Lisl, about like bringing people in, and instead of like pushing people away and being like, no, you just drop your money and that's the only job you have. I think people with wealth and privilege do have a big job to do, which is convincing their peers, doing political work, etc. So like that is a very important part of the work. You just have to be very clear of like, where do you want funders to participate? Where do you want activists to participate? And which circles? We also have a couple of circles, like the admin circle, where it's just staff, because I don't want anybody to participate there because it's not necessary. So really being conscious and choiceful about like, where do you make that participation a priority? And where do you invest that time that it also takes to make it work? I'm going to stop there.
All right. I think we've concluded the bulk of the inputs, and I want to thank you both for guiding us in a lot of different directions. And I know that it's still a nascent field, so for us constantly in this landscape, some of these things might also seem obvious, whereas I know that there's a lot of organizations that are trying to do a community-based approach to philanthropy. There's a lot of different practices happening. They also have their own lingo and value systems and approaches and emphases. So we're also just showcasing some options. We are also aware of others with other emphases, whether they're in terms of practice or value system or worldview. And what we're trying to get at is it's really important to learn from each other. And that's also why we're doing this series, is just to facilitate more conversation on this topic and experiment with more such models, because it will need some proof that different participatory models do work, that the unsexy stuff that Lisl was mentioning can be valued, can spread, and that there's simply more robust evidence to show that alternative ways of redistributing resources and empowering grassroots communities are possible. And not just possible, preferable. So thank you both for this. We can stop the camera rolling.